So next up, we're going to talk about if all babies should have their genomes sequenced, whether or not we should take a step forward with modifying the basic structure of our DNA. So to discuss this, we're going to talk to Daniel Kraft, Zoe McDougall from Oxford Nanopore, Sakshi Shabda Mittal from SoftBank Vision Fund, and to lead our conversation, Gemma Milne. Everyone please come to the stage. Come on in. Thank you. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy your
Hello, everyone.
conversation.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel. I'm excited to get into this topic. We've already been having quite a, shall we say, animated discussion backstage. There's lots of agreement, disagreement, so hopefully we can bring that here and show you how this topic is a little bit complex and with a lot of nuance that we want to bring to you guys today. But before we get started, let's do a little brief round of introductions and give you guys a little bit of context as to where we're all coming from on this theme. So my name's Gemma. I'm a journalist and writer, and I focus on the area of deep tech startups, which a lot of people don't tend to know what that means, but it's basically any kind of startup that's being spun out of the science lab. But I also think a lot about hype and idealism in science and tech and the effects of hype and idealism and the way that we build and progress. So I'm going to be coming from maybe my sort of skepticist journalist side as well as my, shall we say, techno-optimist deep tech startup side. But before we kind of get in, I'd love the three of you to kind of give us a little bit of an intro, who you are, and briefly where you're sort of coming from when it comes to this topic of genetically sequencing and modifying babies. Zoe, why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Zoe McDougall. I work for the company Oxford Nanopore. We were founded in 2005, and we developed a revolutionary way of doing DNA sequencing. And to set the context, the question, should we sequence every baby at birth, certainly 10 years ago was a question that feel quite futuristic, but the first genome cost about $3 billion to sequence, the second cost about $3 million, and the cost has fallen. We can now sequence a genome for, say, $600. But the other thing we can do is more universal access to DNA sequencing information. So I've brought a prop with me. This is what we make. This is MinION. It's the only portable DNA sequencer, and this will give you 10 copies of a human genome sequence on it. It's very accessible. What we're trying to do is enable the analysis of any living thing by any person in any environment, which of course has huge possibilities, but there are obviously implications of that we have to think about quite carefully. So it's a very interesting debate.
Thank you, Zoe. Daniel.
Hi, Daniel Kraft. I'm a physician. I chair medicine for Singularity University and run a program called Exponential Medicine, where we look at the implications and pace and speed of technologies like sequencing and how those are going to reshape health and medicine. And just from my perspective, I have a 16-year-old. When she was in utero, she had amniocentesis, the needle in to pull out some cells and check for sometimes genetic issues. My now 3-year-old didn't get that procedure. My wife didn't. She had blood-based testing, which did some sequencing, but now you don't even need to wait for the baby to be born to sequence them. You can even start to do that with circulating fetal DNA. And I think it's going to become quite ubiquitous. The challenge is, so what? Now that you can have the full genome of yourself or your newborn child, it's only going to be useful if we can put that data together and make it actionable to hopefully, as a pediatrician, see that patient in the clinic and have an idea about how to optimize their diet, their lifestyle, or other screening throughout life. So I think that's one end of the spectrum. The other we'll probably get to is the fast pace of even gene modification. If you know your child may have a risk for a certain disease, you want to screen for that, doing IVF in the test tube, pick the right embryo, all the way now to the brave new world of gene editing with CRISPR, and only 6 or 7-year-old technology already being used to create gene therapies out of the body, but as you've heard in China, even the first CRISPR baby. So from scanning to modifying to printing, a lot of implications.
Amazing, Daniel. Sakshi.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sakshi, and I'm from the SoftBank Vision Fund. We are a $100 billion technology-focused fund. We like investing in large markets. We believe in technology, reshaping, recreating, breaking these markets, and we're all up for supporting those kind of companies. We believe most decisions are going to be data-driven, and healthcare is one such market where there's a lot of data that's trapped in this sequencing, genetic sequencing market, and we believe that this can really unlock a lot of new applications and make healthcare very intelligent. I've done most of our healthcare investments. Our thesis started with the genomic cost curves coming down faster than Moore's law. That's what kind of got us excited about this. We've got a whole bunch of investments in this space, and if you ask us, we remain excited about technologies like CRISPR. Would you sequence a baby for the right reason? Absolutely. So we like supporting new science, new technologies.
Amazing. So I think before we get into some of the bigger questions, I think we all know there's a lot of ethical questions when it comes to talking about genetic sequencing and modification. But I'd love to start with where we are now. So we'll get on to China in a second. You alluded to it already, Daniel. But Zoe, maybe you can start with, what can we actually do? You've got this little device here that we can actually go in and sequence. What is it we're already able to do, and what are we able to do as a result of the sequencing? Zoe.
So it's quite possible now to sequence a whole genome, and we know quite a lot about the results of what that genome means for human beings, but we don't by any stretch of the imagination know everything. So you can think about simple diseases where there is a direct relationship between a gene and the disease, or you can think about more complex diseases like diabetes and heart disease where there may be multiple genes that affect that disease, but also epigenetic effects. So each DNA base can be modified, and that can happen accidentally, or it can happen by smoking, environmental effects, and that can be highly influential on disease. And then, of course, as well as DNA, there's something called RNA, which is what's actually happening, how those genes are being expressed in your body. So the biology is amazingly complicated, and while we have made huge bounds in understanding that, there is a vast quantity of analysis to be done over the next 10 years. And I think Sakshi is obviously investing in a lot of companies who are going to make that happen.
I think for me, the most actionable would be, say, cancer. Liquid biopsies have completely changed, the fate of cancer patients, I would say. Back in the day, you had to open someone up to take a sample of their tissue and then study it, and the results would come back in 1 month, and maybe the cancer would have completely been in a different, state after that month. But today, with just a blood draw, you can measure real time the state of cancer, what medication would be perfectly suited for this patient. And now companies are moving earlier and earlier. So we have a company, Guardant Health, which was the first to commercialize liquid biopsies. It IPO'd last year, and it's been a very successful IPO. So clearly the markets are very excited about this stuff. They now want to detect cancer earlier, so move down. So even prior to phase 1. So if, imagine, on a yearly basis, you do a yearly blood draw, you could just pay, say, $500 or even lesser maybe. And if you were predispositioned to have cancer, you could just know whether or not, you've got cancer in, pre-phase 1 stages. Completely changed your life, your survival rate from 10% to now 90%. So I think that's the most actionable and most exciting thing, I think, today.
Okay, so we know that we can already sequence these genomes, get information out. There's questions as to how much information we can analyze so far. But let's assume that technology is going to keep moving forward. Science is going to keep moving forward. We're going to be able to realize creating new treatments, editing, and so on and so forth. Let's go back to, again, what happens in China. Because I think it would be remiss to not mention what I suppose is the biggest news story in this space at the moment. Daniel, you mentioned earlier, so I'm going to start with you. Can you contextualize what happened and why there's been such controversy around this modification?
So in China, a couple of things have happened. There's a company called BGI, Beijing Genomics. It's already done, I think, millions of Chinese, and they have maybe arguably less privacy laws there than we might have in Europe and the US. And before we just BGI, I just want to go back to one low-hanging fruit. We have a challenge today even to take our basic genetic information, might be 23andMe information or beyond, to use that if I'm a primary care doctor or an oncologist. How do I put that in context to even do what's called pharmacogenetics, picking the right statin or blood pressure med, let alone the right therapy or cocktail for a cancer? And I know as an oncologist, we call it lung cancer, but there's thousands or millions of types, and that's what the gardens of the world are letting you do happen. But shifting to China, what's exciting there partly is that now they're doing millions of sequences, but they're also moving quickly into this era of gene editing. And that was what was in the news in January, that the first sort of quote-unquote CRISPR baby was created, arguably not in an ethically done, controlled, scientifically approved manner, but now we can read DNA, and then the CRISPR, which is only this 6-7-year-old technology, can start to edit DNA. And in this case, they went to edit children that may have had a risk for HIV. The real potential, much earlier than that, is to use CRISPR to take a individual who's already a child or adult who has a simple genetic disease like sickle cell disease or thalassemia. Simple in that there's a single gene, a single base pair that we already have identified, and that could potentially be swapped out. My clinical field is bone marrow transplantation. We can take out the bone marrow from a sickle cell patient, swap out the genes in those stem cells and retransplant them and essentially cure those children for life from a genetic disorder. That might be disruptive to pharma companies as well. But moving forward, these technologies are sometimes moving more quickly than the ethics and the policymakers can keep up with. And the question will not only be, again, can we read DNA, but start to write it not in already grown individuals, but in utero. And that has a lot of interesting ethical implications for the future.
But then I suppose that kind of goes back to the question, right? So if we're framing the potential of sequencing and having this understanding, we're framing the potential of what we can do if we can edit. What was the uproar? Why are people upset about what happened?
Well, it raises a bit of the question of genetic haves and have-nots. There's a 20-year-old movie called Gattaca, which the baby's born, it is a genetic not-have, and the child becomes, it's Ethan Hawke in the movie, has a bad life because he's not a genetic have and he can't become an astronaut. What happens in the near future when everyone's sequenced and we can tell, well, you're a genetic 10 and you're a genetic 5? Are we going to hire people differently? Are you going to have people marry differently based on...
I think that's a bigger thing. I'm more talking about at the moment, right? So if we're going to assume that we create this technology in an ethical way, we're going to be able to do amazing things. Yes, we can talk about these faraway ideas and these faraway kind of issues. Let's get on to that later. But I want to come back to right now. I want to come back to what is happening right now. What are the questions right now that we need to be discussing? So for instance, in China, we talked about the fact that we don't know about side effects, for instance. We don't know what the effect is going to be on these twins. It was done without an ethical board and so on and so forth. Actually, you were talking earlier on backstage about how do you feel about how we can progress this technology in a way that's not taking undue risk, for instance?
Yeah, so I have a slightly different take on it. I'm aware of all the challenges and risks and the whole ethical regulatory side of this technology, but I just feel like this is a part of technology evolution, science evolution. If you date back drugs, back in the day there were no drugs, and we used to just treat our own illnesses through plants and herbal remedies and whatnot. Then pharmaceutical industries came about. We didn't know, what the off-target effect of a drug would be. We knew it could cure a headache, but we didn't know what else it was doing. So we cautiously, systematically, we stayed optimistic and we figured it out. We're not there yet, right? So this is in a similar place where, we were now, evolved into this new science, new technology. I think we should remain cautiously optimistic and, progress this in a systematic way.
And just to pick up on one of the points you made, I think that the debate that was caused about the China incident was the risk-benefit ratio was completely wrong. So the bit of DNA was spliced in conferred additional resistance to acquiring HIV, which is an infectious disease that you would not expect a father and baby to be at risk from. And so it was, in many ways, a sort of slightly pointless thing to do when you don't understand what the off-target effects were. Yeah. So it wasn't a devastating disease that they were really trying to do. So the risk-benefit was completely wrong, and the ethics were not well conducted. So in a way, it's been a sort of a useful trigger for the scientific community within China and outside China to work out what the right thing to do is, and also to realize that the technology is here right now, and the ethical debates are really important to accelerate.
So let's go back to this idea of risk-benefit. Let's talk about sequencing in particular. How would you frame the risk-benefit of sequencing all babies, for instance?
So it's a really good question. I really enjoyed reading the question and dissecting the question. So firstly it said, should we sequence all babies at birth? So who is we? Is we the state? Is we the family? Is we the individual? Who owns that data? And part of what we're trying to do as a company is, in a way, democratize access to this data. But you sequence a baby at birth, that may be a very, very useful thing to do. You have a pocket of data that you could interrogate either instantly at birth or perhaps throughout that baby's life when you wanted something like pharmacogenetic information. And I personally have been into an operation and had pharmacogenetic information used in an emergency situation to change my anesthetic. So I've sort of probably had it paid for myself if that had been me. But you've also got to think about the ethical things like Feynman's idea about a baby or a child's right to a free future. So if you imagine a scenario where you have found out, aged 1, that you have a 25% risk of a complex disease, and probably by the time 5 years more research has gone into that, that probability will have changed because more and more is being understood about genomics. So if you are growing up, how does that make you feel about your ambition? Do you still want to go to an Ivy League university and study engineering, or maybe take a slightly different future? And this idea about a free future without being burdened with information that is not actionable is a really complex and nuanced argument that we need to make sure happens.
Going back to the we, Sakshi, how do you think about it? You know, you're investing in companies, right? And obviously as an investor, you're going to be looking for a return, you want profit and so on and so forth for these companies. Obviously impact is really important for most investors, but how do you think about the we, should we sequence? How do you think about the business models or the ownership structures around these companies that are growing, that are doing things already, that people are sort of buying into?
That's a very tough question and a very long, it could have a very long answer, but I'll sum it up. So I think, we love data, just like everybody else. There's a lot of data when you sequence something, if you do own that data. So if you're sitting on, I don't know, a database of 2-3 million sequenced, individual unique samples, that's powerful in today's day and age because, we're still quite early in that curve. So that's on the data side. On the business model side, remember, it's not cheap to sequence this stuff. I know our friends are helping us get there to a $10 genome and Illumina and all this kind of stuff. But if you do really deep sequencing to find nuanced things in your genetic code for complicated cancers or complicated diseases, it's very expensive to do in-depth and at-breadth sequencing. Then you have all these new technologies coming in, epigenetics and methylation and all kinds of stuff. So the cost of the sample from a sequencing perspective, that's very important to us because at the end of the day, you have to show us that you are on a path to make some kind of a profit. If your cost is thousands of dollars to sequence this, what are you going to charge the insurance company? Who's going to pay for this stuff? So I think these two things are quite critical when you look at business models.
But it is
Daniel.
moving to almost free. I mean, you mentioned that it's dropping at twice the rate of Moore's Law. Will quite likely be at a $10 genome in 10 years. There are even companies now offering you a free genome if you donate your data. So there's still a question about who owns your data. As a child, as a newborn, you can't decide. Do you own your genetics? Can you crowdsource that? Then there's also the microbiome. There's the digitome. All those things that systems medicine needs to bring together. Because we've heard about nature nurture. Genes are not destiny. It's often integrated with other information. So we need to, as I mentioned in my earlier talk, think about ourselves hopefully as data donors, hopefully owning our data, opting in, maybe even getting rewarded for sharing it, like the Google Maps example. So there's lots of challenges and opportunities there as these technologies emerge. And it's only been, 20 years since the first genome's been sequenced.
And let's go back to what you said earlier, Daniel, about the have and have-nots, because for me, this is actually, I think, the most intriguing question when it comes to genetic editing is actually when you come back to the idea of choice. So if you're talking about, for instance, sequencing babies at birth, the baby obviously doesn't have any choice. Maybe the parents does, maybe they don't, maybe the state does. But when he starts talking about if it becomes the norm, for instance, that we start modifying and so on and so forth, and someone opts not to be modified, are they then disadvantaged in the sense of being part of society? Like email, for instance. Anyone here that decides not to have an email is losing out on the societal benefit of being, the part of a digitally connected society. What happens when it's the norm to modify at birth? How do you think about things like this?
Well, we're really in an era, I mean, think about evolution, Darwinism. It's small changes that randomly happen. Now we're in an era of really being able to hack Darwin. So certain societies may, or countries may move that faster. My joke is, is China doing this already? Well, let's look at the Chinese Olympic team in 18 years. Maybe they're going to genetically add in testosterone genes or other elements. There's lots of elements that go in that regard. And back to the have and have-nots, are we going to start, again, discriminating? Here in Europe, there's a history of eugenics in the 1930s. Several 100,000 people were sterilized because they were not genetically optimized. So it's a really, like any technology, 3D printing can be used to print an organ or a medical device or print a gun. AI can be used for good or for bad. CRISPR can be used to treat a disease or bioterrorize a virus. So I think we need to be having the ethicists in the room think forward, but not hindering progress and investment, but being mindful going forward.
What do you guys think is, who's going to make this decision, right? If the question is around, should we, or, we already know we can, or we will be able to, but should we genetically sequence modify babies? Who makes that choice? Is it the state? Is it the parents? What do you guys think? I know there's not one right answer, but I'm curious to see who you think should be making that decision. Zoe?
So if you think about different healthcare systems, obviously the answer is going to be different in different places. So in the UK, where you have a socialised healthcare system and it's access to all, the answer is going to be completely different to the US, where you have an insurance-led healthcare system. But then is there a role to think globally about where to spend the money? One of the things we were thinking about earlier is DNA information and what could have the greatest impact. Well, actually, you could choose to pursue CRISPR adaptations, and that would have an immense impact. But you could also choose to try and use DNA information to track antimicrobial resistance throughout your water supply and your hospital chain, which is going to, in 2050, kill maybe 10 million people a year because the drugs the bugs are winning the war against the drugs. So who takes those decisions? How high up does it go is a really important question.
Well, it also comes back to that thing around this, as a society. So for instance, if you look at Finland, for instance, where they've got a big push to sequence all the adults, and part of the rationale behind it is it helps for public health planning. So if you know the curve of possibility of diabetes, for instance, you can invest more or less in different kind of preventative measures. That seems like a sort of state, sort of guardianship decision.
But imagine if that was China. That would be really scary.
Right.
I think that this decision should lie with the parents. Again, with the free ownership of data rule or whatever. I think it should lie with the parents. Governments can't start controlling who sequences your
What about
genome.
vaccines?
Sorry?
What about vaccines, though?
Vaccines.
If you look at vaccines, if you put, there's a big discussion at the moment around whether or not people should be vaccinated as a result of the state or versus the parents.
But it does come down to choice, though. It's not like the government recommends that you get vaccinated, but some parents opt out. But you're talking about a world where government decides when a baby is born in a hospital, in an NHS hospital, he should get immediately sequenced. You won't even find out. It's just a part of a routine blood test. The government's owning all your data. That's like the ultimate stepping in your private zone kind of a scenario. And then what if it decides to kick you out one day? In this whole connected, tech-driven, sequenced world, you're not good enough. It kicks you out. Where do you go?
Amazing.
To a different planet?
We're running over to Daniel. I'm going to give you the last word. What do you think in terms of this? Who makes a decision?
I just think, in this exponential age, the future's coming faster and faster, and we need to be mindful about smartly designing systems so we can integrate privacy, but also do public health measures like vaccinate that may or may not be voluntary, and that to be creative about using these technologies to be proactive, all the way to using CRISPR for diagnostics or modifying a pig to make a humanized organ, all the way to the implications it will have for the haves and have-nots, and that everyone in the room needs to be part of that discussion, and we need to be mindful about guiding that path, but not hindering progress at the same time.
I love that, guiding the path without hindering progress. I think we'll leave it at that. As you can probably see, there's quite a lot of nuance to the discussion, and a lot of it is around what we each personally think when it comes to control over our health. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel on this complex but awesome topic. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you to Danielle, Zoe, Sakshi, and Gemma. Fascinating discussion. I think we all know a little bit more about whether or not we should have our genome sequenced. So, this was a wonderful morning. Are you guys enjoying yourselves? Yes? Excellent. How about you, Pinard?
Too. I am enjoying it. It's so much fun.
Good. I'm glad.
But when is lunch?
When is lunch? Okay, that's a good question. Don't worry, lunch is right now. So we're going to take a break. There's food you probably notice inside the palace, outside the palace, right across here, basically spread out all over, and you can eat all day, every day in the catering area and the Red Salon. We're going to take a 30-minute break. So get a bite to eat, maybe get some fresh air, and don't forget to check out the exhibitions. Don't forget to check out the Stammtisch sessions, which start at 2 p.m. on the main floor. So maybe you can step outside of your comfort zone, meet some people you normally wouldn't meet, and chat with them. And we'll see you back here at 13:35. That's 13:35. Thank you.